all of this is going on, we get a new general of the Continental Army, and it's Nathaniel Greene. And I think, personal opinion, probably the smartest general of the Revolutionary War. And he splits his army, and he moves his headquarters to Cheraw, and he sends Daniel Morgan out to the back area here. While they are running around that area, Francis Marion attacks a column, Colonel McLarock, and that colonel is accompanied by replacements, fusiliers, that they said were a sorry bunch, but anyway. And after that encounter, Marion gets around, and some of his people get to Singleton's mill, but only fire one volley. Then when the British get there, they discovered why Singleton has smallpox. And Francis Marion's men aren't afraid of much, but they're afraid of smallpox. And now this whole area along this side of the Santee is totally controlled by Marion, and the commander at Charleston says they're not going to use it anymore. But one little boat didn't get the word, and they tied up at Nelson's Ferry. Marion took the boat, took all of the supplies off, then burned the boat. So by Christmas, pretty much, of 1780, Francis Marion has closed down the supply route. And Cornwallis is still planning on going to Virginia. But after the Battle of Cowpens, over in this area here, when Tarleton is beaten and that army is destroyed, Morgan has 600 prisoners that he has to get up into Virginia because there's no place to keep them otherwise. And down in the swamp, Francis Marion has a new nemesis. His name is Colonel Watson, and he is left at Nelson's Ferry with the order that he's got to clear out that supply line between Nelson's Ferry and Camden, which means he's going to have to do something about Francis Marion. And he builds Fort Watson on top of an Indian mound, and of course, being a very humble man, he names it after himself, and hoping to control the road. Now, while all of this is going on, Light Horse Harry Lee has been down in South Carolina campaigning with Francis Marion, and they got on beautifully. You know, it's hard to imagine. They're sort of the odd couple of the Revolution, but they got on famously. But when they start moving troops across North Carolina, Lee is recalled, and Watson decides that for once and for all, he is going to get rid of Francis Marion. Now, George Summers is going to cover the Bridges campaign, so I'll only mention it briefly. For roughly a month, the month of March, Marion and Watson fight from Waibu Swamp to Georgetown. Battle after battle, and as I said, George will mention that. Another group under Doyle got, a British group, got to Snow's Island while Marion was gone and destroyed his fortification there. When this was all over at the end of March, most of Marion's men went home. They had to plant. And Marion, being really a career officer, didn't much like it when he had an idea and gave an order and they didn't show up. So he's thinking that he would like to go to Philadelphia and offer his service to Congress and get another assignment, because after all, he's the lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army. And while he is at his lowest, he had black moods. He wasn't the life of the party. He had learned that Light Horse Harry Lee was coming to meet him again, and so he decides not to go to Philadelphia. And when Lee comes, he tells him about Greene's plan. That after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis's army was in terrible shape. And Greene knew the British would have to quit. Not only had Marion been taking out a few at a time, and Sumter had been taking out a few more at a time, all of these small skirmishes had resulted in British casualties. The Battle of Camden, which the British won, they still lost 1 in 5 of their British redcoats, and they had 800 soldiers in Camden who were too sick to ever get to the battlefield. They lost 1,000 men at Kings Mountain. They lost 97 troopers at Blackstocks. They lost 1/4 of the British Army at Cowpens and all of their light infantry. In the dash across North Carolina, Cornwallis lost 17% of his men to death, desertion, disease, and now at Guilford Courthouse, he won the battle, but he lost 27% of his men and 29 officers killed or mortally wounded. And Greene knew that England could not continue that kind of loss. But when England did decide to cease the hostilities, they would be able to keep everything they held. It was international law at the time. It's called Uta Thucydides. Everything that the British held, they would keep. Now, if that had happened right after Guilford Courthouse, they probably would have claimed North Carolina. They had South Carolina. Georgia was a royal colony. So if the war had ended then, at your baseball games, you would be singing God Save the Queen, because the South would have belonged to England, and Greene knew it. He did not follow Cornwallis. He turned his army south, and the intention is he is going to take back the territory before England can, surrender really, and before England can claim the South. And all of this is explained to Francis Marion, and he's gung-ho again, and Greene intends to hit the big areas, the big posts, and is depending on the militia to take the small ones. Lee and Marion go to Fort Watson, and you all know the story. Watson had been smart enough to cut down all the trees, and so the Patriots built a tower, and on the top put riflemen, and then started to attack the abattis on the bottom of the fort, and any British soldier who stuck his head up to shoot down on them got shot from the platform. And so Lieutenant McKay surrendered. The British force were roughly 150. And then Marion and Lee moved over to Fort Mott and started the siege. Greene moved into Camden and was thoroughly beaten at the Battle of Hobkirk Hill by Lord Rawdon. He retreated, and Rawdon went after him, because Rawdon wanted to do what Cornwallis had not been able to do. He wanted to destroy Greene. And Greene kept moving back, and as he moved back, he was always on his own supply line. And he was pulling Rawdon farther away from Camden. And Camden was not so far from Fort Mott that Lee and Marion, with their mounted, couldn't have gotten there in a hurry, because Marion is documented as being able to go through the swamp at night on horseback 50 miles. So Rawdon went back to Camden. He has no salt. He doesn't have enough medicine. He's got a huge number of wounded. The supplies have not been coming through. He then evacuates Camden and moves down, hoping to get to Fort Mott where all the supplies were. And before he gets there, Fort Mott falls. Greene comes to Fort Mott and meets with Marion and Lee. Sends Lee out. Lee takes Fort Granby. Sumter takes Orangeburg. And Francis Marion heads towards Georgetown, which he will eventually take. So a few weeks after Greene had made that decision, he's already moved the British out of most of the north area, north of the Santee River. And now, Greene moves over to siege 96, sends Leghorse Harry Lee, Andrew Pickens, and Elijah Clark toward Augusta. And they take the British out of Augusta and push the British down to Savannah. And another one of those things that you wouldn't, if you made it up, people wouldn't believe it. Cornwallis sends word from Virginia to Lord Rawdon in Charleston and says that 2,000 new troops are coming from Ireland, but do not let them land. Send them on to Virginia. But Rawdon doesn't get the message. Marion's scouts get it. They send it on to Greene, and Greene now knows that Rawdon is going to have some fresh troops, and he will come. And he does. And he takes those Irish troops, the flank companies, in their woolen uniforms, who have been training in Ireland, and in the middle of the summer, quick marches them to 96 and breaks the siege. And Greene moves back, again, on his own supply lines. He never lets the British get behind him. And Rawdon goes after him for a while, but after 50 of his men die of heat stroke, he decides that that's not a great idea. He evacuates 96. He had once before sent orders for them to evacuate. They didn't get that either. So he now evacuates 96 and moves over toward the Santee River, and the troops who had been at 96 accompanied the Tories to Charleston. Now at this point, Rawdon is sick. I mean, it isn't just his failures that are making him sick. He's been sick all along with malaria. And he decides that he's going back to England, so he turns over his command to Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Stewart. And he goes to Charleston. And Greene takes his troops to the high hills of the Santee, moves them up around this way, and it's the middle of the summer, the dog days of summer. Sumter is in the field, Marion is in the field, William Washington's cavalry is in the field, Light Horse Harry Lee in the field, and moving all around this area. But there are British along the Santee River. And in the 1st of August, a tragedy occurs in Charleston because the British take prisoner Isaac Hayne. And in what Francis Marion thought was a mockery of a trial, they declare him guilty of treason, I guess, and they hang him publicly in Charleston. Marion is furious. Greene says we will make the British officers pay. And Marion, who's at Pierre's plantation here, takes 200 men. They don't know where they're going. He never told anybody where they were going. They knew they were going someplace because they had baked sweet potatoes and cornmeal mush in their haversacks, which suggested they were going to be gone for a while. And in 2 nights and 1 day, they had crossed the Ashley and the Cooper and the Edisto, and were over 100 miles. They'd moved between British troops in Dorchester and British troops in Charleston, and they were never detected. Because Marion wanted Major Fraser of South Carolina Royalists. He had taken Hayne prisoner, and he was at Hayne's plantation, which is down by Jacksonville. And never knows how, but we know from an account of a British officer, a Tory officer actually, Jarvis, and he says that 125 troopers were killed on the causeway and many more were wounded. And he said that we never saw the enemy, we only saw the flash of their weapons. Now he says that the enemy never lost a man, but Francis Marion does mentioned that he lost 1 private killed and 2 privates wounded. And Marion moves back to Pierre's plantation, and again, evidently moves undetected, because Stewart, who is now at Utah Springs, writes to his commander and says, well, I have heard that Greene is moving, but he's not going to attack, because he won't attack without Francis Marion, and Francis Marion is down on the Edisto. Francis Marion was no longer at the Edisto. He was back, got word, found out that Greene was moving down from the north on the river and wanted Marion to join him. So Marion took roughly 260 mounted men around the British camp at night and was never detected. The next day, or 2 days later, Greene moved the American army within 7 miles of the British army, and the British did not know they were there until a small detachment of cavalry happened on a group that they thought were just a few local militia, and discovered that they had run into Lee's Legion and the whole American army. And they then formed for the Battle of Utah Springs. Now, why people don't know more about the Battle of Utah Springs, I do not know. For one thing, we've just got that little 2-acre plot down there that tells you absolutely nothing. But if you consider, the Americans had about 2,000 men there, and the British had about 2,000 men. That's a pretty big battle, for heaven's sakes. The people that you had at that battle, in the middle of the road, you had North Carolina militia under Malmedy. To his right, you had Francis Marion. To his right, you had Light Horse Harry Lee. And from the middle of the road to the left, you had Andrew Pickens. Behind them, you had the North Carolina Continentals under Jethro Sumner, who had a tremendous career in the north until he got sick at Valley Forge and had to come home. You had John Eager Howard, a hero of Cowpens. You had Robert Kirkwood, a hero of Cowpens, of the Delaware unit. William Washington and his cavalry, another hero of Cowpens. You had Wade Hampton, if you want a local hero of a family that was known for generations. Then Richard Campbell of Virginia, who was killed on that field. And have I missed anybody? Seconded? But Arthur Williams commanded. It was second in command, and he was from Maryland. And the whole thing commanded by Nathaniel Greene. I mean, that's who's who in the Revolutionary period. Everybody that was anybody was there except George Washington. And most of the world has never heard tell of it. And of course, South Carolina hasn't helped because they really, they just had that little park down there that tells you absolutely nothing. The battle was the bloodiest battle of the Revolution. Greene finally moved back after 3 or 4 hours in the September heat because he's out of water. He needs to regroup. He's lost control of some plunderers, and he certainly has a lot of wounded. He intends to come back the next day. But when he does, and he sent Francis Marion and Light Horse Harry Lee around behind the British, and everything seemed to be in control. When he went back the next day, the British are evacuating, and Greene chooses not to attack. He doesn't need to. He wants them out of there, and they are going. And so he goes back to the battlefield, takes up his wounded, the British wounded, takes them all back to the high hills of the Santee. And roughly 5 weeks after the Battle of Utah Springs, Lord Cornwallis surrenders the British at Yorktown. And the British have no claim to North and South Carolina and Georgia. They have the port of Savannah, they have Charleston's Neck, but they have no way of feeding them. And so, of course, I get in trouble with these serious historians because I think the Americans won at the Battle of Eutaw Springs, but it doesn't matter who won at Eutaw Springs. Greene won the campaign. Now, the war wasn't over. A lot of people think that the war was over with Yorktown. And it wasn't. The British were in South Carolina for another 15 months. A civilian government was established, and of course, Francis Marion was a senator, and he was really torn and not terribly effective because Rutledge had a list of things for him to do. Greene had a list of things for him to do. He had to stay every time the government was in session, so they'd have a quorum. And Marion's men didn't do always very well when he wasn't around taking care of things. So his last few skirmishes were not terribly successful. Now, the tragedy of this whole thing is that when the British finally left Charleston, 14th of December, 1782, the Council of Charleston planned the event. And Greene and Anthony Wayne would march in with the Continental Army as the British moved out. The militia were not allowed in Charleston even as spectators. Andrew Pickens, Francis Marion, all that they had done, they were not permitted in Charleston. Greene invited Marion to go, and Marion said, well, he'd never had smallpox and he'd heard it was in the city, so he decided he wouldn't go. So the day after, he dismissed his troops at Fair Lawn and thanked them for 2.5 years of the most brutal conditions that man had ever endured, and said that if this unhappy country ever needs you again, I know that you'll come and do it again. And he moved back to Pond Bluff, and you'll learn tomorrow night, you will learn from Mary Esther his life there. Now, I usually talk about Francis Marion, Stranger Than Fiction. It's a wonderful story. And Marion did not have a PR person to build up his reputation. He became almost mythological because of the men that rode with him. Now, for a minute, I want you to imagine that you rode with Marion, that you are in the swamp at Parker's Ferry. It has been a very, very wet season, so you're probably up to your knees in muck. There is every kind of stinging insect and reptile imaginable in that swamp. And you are on very slim rations, you have very little ammunition, and you see a British column of riders come. They are well armed, they are well uniformed, they are well fed, and they go down the line in front of you. You do not give away the ambush. You do not run. You do not fire prematurely, but you wait for the order to fire from this strange, remote, ugly little man. Now, if you do not believe that he will pull this off as he's pulled off so many ambushes before, if you do not believe that he will protect your life to the very end, if you don't believe that he's the finest militia commander in the South, what are you doing in that stinking, sweltering swamp? I rest my case. Thank you.
think Thank you. I'm speaking to this group. I've wondered for 6 years what it would be like to have the opportunity to do it, and it came about because one John Riley Warner called up, and I'll show you what he said a little bit later on. But basically, due to the business environment that we find ourselves in, he was unable to come down here. So I thought I'd go ahead and give it a shot. And I thought, what's more ridiculous than a business guy that's never been shot at talking about guerrilla tactics? Well, maybe it's a fighter pilot talking about business tactics. But I did, before I became a fighter pilot, I had 2 years in the business world as a consulting engineer. And as Marine Land in her gaggle with the Weldon Auditorium will tell you, the consulting engineering and architect business is not all it's cracked up to be either. And incidentally, we're glad to have Senator Land's boss here with us this afternoon. The whole part of this thing that I get out of it is people don't seem to be having fun doing business, and particularly these days. And I don't understand why. I mean, it was easy come. We put $50 in 30 years ago, and all of a sudden we had $5,000 in our bank accounts. Why should we worry if it's back to $50? That's all we had to start with anyway. So we got to have fun doing it. And for those that are still gainfully employed, well, everybody actually, I want to tell you a story about my dad. We were out walking and can you all hear me? If you can't hear me, I'll put it back on. But we were walking in the high Sierras, and I always wondered if there was any one job. He was in the construction business. And I always wondered if there was any one job that he really enjoyed doing, you know, that was really stood out in his career. And so I asked him, Dad, you know, which of your jobs that you had around the world did you really think was the most fun? And he stopped and he looked at me like he didn't know what I was talking about. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, did you have fun on any of your jobs? And he said, no, that was work. And I thought, you know, what world did I live in that for 30 years it was fun to go to work every day? I mean, even when you knew they were going to blow your tail away if you screwed up. So, you know, I think in our jobs, in our life, we don't think about having fun nearly enough. And along that line, you know, one thing I've decided, and that is that I'm going to hang around on this plane of existence until Wright Turbeville gets up with St. Peter. Because I can't think of a better guy than a preacher and an attorney and a judge to represent me before St. Peter. This is what John Warner sent us. And I thought, we live in scary and disappointing times. This is a guy that's going to talk to us about guerrilla tactics in the real world and in business. What about old Francis Marion? Do you suppose he ever stopped to say, you know, we live in scary and disappointing times? I just can't see that guy doing that. You know, I just had 20 Sam shot at me tonight. I landed and went to the bar, and I didn't say, man, this is scary and disappointing times. I said, give me another beer.